So the first speaker is Professor Nathan Connolly, and Professor Connolly is the author of A World More Concrete, Real Estate and the Remaking of Jim Crow South Florida, and he is now working on a book on the Negro problem in American history. And his topic today is bulldozing Jim Crow. Professor Connolly.
No, that's okay. I'll just project.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm extraordinarily pleased to see the turnout. I teach at a relatively small school as far as the undergraduate college is concerned. So usually I get about 15 or 20 people to show up to events, so this is a little bit bigger. I appreciate that. I also appreciate the infrastructure. I made the mistake of bringing my laser pointer today to try to point out things in my PowerPoint presentation, but now I realize there are two screens here, so I don't know which one to point at. So I'm just going to use my voice to try to guide you to read the slides a little bit. And if needed, maybe pick one to go to. As Arthur mentioned, my work deals primarily with questions of real estate and capitalism. I'm very pleased to be presenting my work in front of one of your own who was very influential in formulating my own ideas about real estate and capitalism, my dear friend David Freund, who's in the house this evening. Appreciate him and all the work that he's done. And he and I have had a number of really rich conversations over the years about race and property and protests. And my approach to civil rights tends to be as a kind of gadfly figure. I try to trouble certain ideas and assumptions that people have about radicalism and interracial politics in particular. What I want to share with you this afternoon is my own take on interracial politics and a social movement of a particular kind. When you are coming up through middle school and high school and college, and they're talking about interracial politics of the 1960s, you tend to get a lot of images of protest marches and voter registration drives, and those kinds of political actions are quite important. When you think about civil rights and voting rights, some of the most dramatic theaters of struggle and opposition and heroism are around these issues. My work focuses on a different set of rights, and that's property rights, and the extent to which property rights have remained at the center of political organizing, at the center of interracial politics, and also deeply complicate our notions of radicalism and civil rights protest. I want to share with you today a vision of the moment of the civil rights movement that provides a little bit of color to what we assume to be a very standard story. Protest marches and heroic standoffs against state troopers and the like happened a fair amount, but in terms of how they were documented, in terms of how we think about them, they're kind of the exception that proves the rule, right? There was a whole body of literature in the mid-1990s especially that took to trying to figure out everyday forms of resistance, because for Jim Crow especially to have lasted as long as it did, people wondered why there wasn't even more protest, why there wasn't even more upheaval. And part of what my work tries to explore are the everyday politics that allowed Jim Crow to function on a day-to-day basis, and that allowed segregation to be one of the most profitable instruments for growing the American economy, building notions of wealth, and ultimately visions of self-determination for people of color. I tend to start my discussions of these issues, well, there's the keyboard here, I'm sorry. Did you touch the screen? How does this work? You know, anybody know how you move the slide? The space bar, the keyboard here, I'm sorry. All right, here we go. Booyah, all right. It's too high tech, really. I need one screen, one keyboard. I tend to start this discussion with a park that was opened in 1969, a proud moment in the city of Miami, where I'm from, where I went to college, and where my book, A World More Concrete, draws much of its source base. In 1969, at the end of a long, hot summer, Athalie Range, who's pictured here at the center, was the city of Miami's first commissioner, black city commissioner. And she established what people were calling America's first under-expressway park. She worked in tandem with NAACP organizers, local city officials, and a number of people who are interested in the well-being of the Negro population in South Florida. This moment was the last of several moments, or a later moment of interracial compromise and organizing that really marked what people call the conference table approach to interracial organizing. In South Florida, for civil rights organizations, by and large, what you tried to do was have some kind of formal protest that then started a conversation between members of the Chamber of Commerce, members of the local city commission, and the like. Now, this particular park struck me as being kind of amazing because it makes no sense as to why you would want to build a park underneath an expressway. Right? What are some of the advantages of this? And this particular playground was built on top of a neighborhood that was demolished for a highway project, the building of I-95. It was a project that was meant to connect beaches and airports and suburbs, a collective spirit of economic growth and uplift. And when people talked about the park, they talked about it as being an amazing idea, a great idea. This image is drawn from Miami's black newspaper of record, the Miami Times, and it celebrates Atherley Range's vision as being the latest expression in a really storied history of smart civil rights compromise. This struck me as utterly absurd when I first encountered it. And I didn't know what sense to make of it. When I started looking a little bit deeper, I realized that there was a different kind of interracial politics that were already in development and that are as much a part of the civil rights movement as anything else that we've been talking about for the last 50 years in terms of literature. So this picture here is the park being celebrated in the paper. And you have the image here that also came from the Miami Times. I became much more interested in this ad right here. Bonded rental agency for my folks on this side. The man in that picture is a man by the name of Luther Brooks, or L.L. Brooks. He was a Georgian, born in southern Georgia. He was, by and large, a segregationist in the scheme of southern segregationist politics. And he was considered to be probably the most powerful political player in the city of Miami. He had support among blacks and support among whites, and his ability to help people make money from rental property made him an installation in a number of deep political debates. I tried to make sense of why someone like Luther Brooks was considered to be so popular and important. You see, as he advertised here, he had the largest private rental housing management agency in the South. About 10,000 units were under his management. And he had a way of talking about collective uplift through property ownership. Now, what makes Brooks important for the broader history of American civil rights is the way we tend to talk about white Southerners, particularly white Southerners who are not actively engaged in civil rights organizing or a part of some kind of protest movement, is that they basically had a pretty flat racial understanding of the color line in Jim Crow. Brooks was a little bit more complicated than your average white Southerner, right? He was somebody who recognized that by advancing arguments about property rights, he can in fact build powerful coalitions of white and black property owners around the idea of keeping out urban redevelopment, about making slum housing profitable, and for many black families, actually creating a form of economic security around rental properties. These rental properties, in turn, would help to fund the formal activism that would be carried out through different kinds of boycotts, through different kinds of voter registration drives. Brooks himself was a profound benefactor to black people through organizing them to vote, having them build companies around his real estate industry. And so what I want to do this afternoon is at least have you think a little bit about how someone like Brooks needs to be folded into our more storybook understanding about civil rights. Now, part of the post-war period and the period that really shaped black political struggle actually revolves around displacement and the history of displacement. Since the late 19th century, land dispossession from African Americans was a dominant feature of white racial power. And in 1947, a community called Railroad Shops Covered Edition was seized by local white homeowners who were hoping to essentially keep the color line hard and keep their neighborhood from being blighted by black neighbors. Now, during the event, black homeowners sought the redress from the state through the help of a black attorney, a man named Lawson Thomas, who was in fact the first black judge appointed in the South after Reconstruction. Now, Thomas was a race man of the Booker T. Washington variety. He understood the importance of powerful white friends, and he relatively believed that if you worked out politics at the local level, things would improve. He actually opposed fair employment enforcement because he thought it took the idea of negotiation out of local hands and put it in the hands of the federal government. people sought redress from the state through Lawson Thomas, and Thomas basically threw his hands up after the railroad shop expulsion and said, there really isn't much I can do. Now, what's really tragic about the railroad shop story is that the people who lost their homes to white police officers and school board officials who basically wanted to build a school on this property, they found themselves in a position to either have to negotiate a price for their home, or some of them had their homes physically lifted out of the ground and moved to another location, which a month later was struck by a hurricane and all of their fortunes were lost. And the narratives about the struggle in 20th century Miami revolved around how people like Luther Brooks ended up riding to the rescue and finding ways to give homes to people, or rental properties to people, who had lost their homes through this negotiation for displacement. Here's just a shot of Brooks donating $1,000 to a local nursery, and again building his kind of renown among some of the black leadership in South Florida. So the dynamic I want to describe is one of urban paternalism, represented by Luther Brooks, and one of suburban promise. The title of my talk, in terms of bulldozing Jim Crow, describes on the one hand the actual practices of demolishing along racial lines, right? Having a Jim Crow approach to displacement and dispossession. But there were also arguments that were made that if you find a way to use dispossession or a law of a power called eminent domain, taking private land for public good, you could in fact get rid of some of the worst indignities of the Jim Crow South. And many people looked at Luther Brooks as being an enabler of some of those worst indignities because he took advantage of slum property. In the post-war period, a lot of whites understood their position to be protected by the federal government. There's a longer story that we can hopefully have during Q&A about how people began to believe less in the power of the federal government once it stopped protecting their racial privileges. I won't go into much detail here, but suffice it to say that many people felt quite comfortable making arguments in public about having whites-only communities, about allowing the federal government or the local government to support their desire to not have quote-unquote nigger neighbors. That's an actual telegram written to the governor with someone's name and address scrawled on it. Again, very open kind of language. Or allowing through the financing of housing, the continuation of color lines that existed in what was believed to be existing in the 19th century. Now, this is an image of Detroit, Michigan, in fact, and the way that mortgages were given out or risk is allotted to create a market for white housing and colored housing in the Jim Crow South. At the same time, in the post-war period, people believed that suburbs were, in fact, the best place to actualize your citizenship and take advantage of an emerging consumer economy. And what's important to remember here is even as most white Americans were privileged for taking advantage of suburban housing, African Americans believed that the suburban promise was there for them as well. And that helped to shape how they would engage in protest movements going forward. This is a quick look at what much of the housing in Jim Crow America looked like for black Americans in contrast to those suburbs, right? Just a quick flavor of housing from Detroit, Baltimore, Miami, and St. Louis. And arguments about improving the housing believed that you could use eminent domain to wipe slums off of the face of American cities. They looked at moments like railroad shop and said, well, if white homeowners can do this to protect their color lines, we can find other ways of actually lifting black people up and demolishing houses and providing opportunities for them to hopefully take advantage of the suburban dream. Interracial politicking around slum clearance became one of the most important moments of compromise and civil rights activism in the immediate post-war period. 1946, 47, 48. This is Elizabeth Varick, an organizer from Miami, who built a slum clearance movement directly after and inspired by the railroad shop displacement, trying to put to progressive use the power of land expropriation. At the very same time, the counter-argument against land expropriation was coming from landlords themselves, and they pointed to their ability to provide, like I mentioned before, jobs and donations. Here's an image of a landlord who's providing Christmas dinners for his tenants. You can see here just a small sampling of what they would offer: chicken, cranberry sauce, cake, and the like. And these kind of small-scale forms of benevolence or paternalism worked quite well in keeping eminent domain power relatively restricted and keeping slum clearance, especially in southern and western cities, off of the table as a form of civil rights activism. This is really important because when you have displacements and demolitions and redevelopments happening in the urban north, they're not happening for another 10 years in the south and west. And what I've discovered is that part of that delay has everything to do with the ability of people like Luther Brooks to basically say, I'm representing the interests of black and white property owners, and guess what? We're engaged in a whole host of practices that are in fact growing opportunities for black Americans. We're building tourist destinations for them, providing access to college football games. We're sponsoring boys softball teams and the like. And we're giving them an opportunity to take advantage in some way, shape, or form of all the benefits that all Americans should in fact be able to take advantage of. And if you get out of the way, federal government, and don't threaten us with slum clearance and definitely not threaten us with public housing, then we'll use other things like the Federal Housing Administration to make use of our own kind of redevelopment programs. What happens in the late 1940s and early 50s is slumlords begin finding a way to use mortgage insurance from the federal government to begin renovating the wooden housing that you saw from those earlier shots and creating what was seemingly more progressive or better concrete housing. Again, this is happening in the context of the bus boycott in Montgomery. This is happening in the context of other kinds of activism that we tend to think of as being the only form of progressive politicking going on. But you had black and white developers working together to build concrete housing. They were working together to open up new suburban enclaves, and they were making the argument that the only way to really provide equality is to get civil rights regulation out of the way and just let the developers and the entrepreneurs do what they're supposed to do. Right? This is, again, a small sample of developments in Chicago, in New Orleans. This is an advertisement for a suburb built for African Americans in Miami as well. The suburban dream, which became largely available in the early to mid-1950s, had the same kinds of attachments that the white suburban dream had. Consumer spaces, green spaces, and bedroom communities. The problem, of course, was that through zoning and the way that whites could still control local government, most black suburbs were built in far-off places, hard to access public transportation and the like. So even their own slice of the suburban promise was segregated. You also had people building concrete walls around developments to make sure that there weren't any unnatural interminglings. And the idea that you could somehow simply develop your way to equality became the dominant perspective in the way that cities were deciding they were going to deal with the Negro problem and the color line. So, unfortunately, as is oftentimes the case, when you let the people who are the targets of regulation regulate themselves, things don't get terribly better, right? And you don't really see the movement of the needle on question of urban redevelopment until you start to see people on the civil rights left say, you know what, we need to ramp up even further the use of land expropriation. And you start to see arguments being made in chambers of commerce by self-appointed activists saying, you know what, we want to rely on new programs of urban renewal, new forms of displacement to try to really have mass-scale demolition. These are two figures of a number of figures who are starting to make arguments in the local media and in other places about the benefits of urban renewal. Someone may or may not have heard of Leroy Collins. He's a Florida governor who was responsible in 1956 for trying to get a handle on the desegregation effort that was happening across the South. He was extremely effective at finding a kind of middle path or a moderate path for dealing with the Negro problem. I'll just give you one example of the kind of arguments that he made in his inaugural address that helped to become the watchword of his administration. Boycotts, ultimatums, peremptory demands can never achieve what persuasion, peaceful petitions, and normal judicial procedures can do for the Negro race. I believe that we can find wise solutions if white citizens will face up to the fact that the Negro does not now have equal opportunities, that the Negro is morally and legally entitled to progress more rapidly. Collins lamented the formation of landlord lobbying groups that kept him from having broad-scale urban redevelopment programs. He eventually used civil rights legislation, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1957, to create new conversations and let people know about the benefits of urban renewal. And they used ideas like the term blight, which seemingly didn't have a racial connotation, to build deep coalitions of black and white activists to say, you know what, we're going to use demolition and we're going to displace some people, but it's better for the reputation of African Americans and it's better for the fate of American cities. Robert Weaver became the first black cabinet member in the U.S. government appointed by Lyndon Johnson. In 1966, he became part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and he was in the seat as the head of HUD when urban renewal began to ramp up and become a really important, seemingly unimpeachable civil rights program. This is an image of Overtown, of downtown Miami black community in 1948. This is what that community looked like a few years later, about 20 years later, after they planted an interstate highway directly onto that community. The Under Expressway Park would be roughly somewhere in here, okay? Part of what I want to try to impart to you all today is that there are a series of transactions that are going on that are informing how these projects get going. If there's anything that you take away from my talk today, it's that you don't have segregation, you don't have white supremacy, you don't have some of the harsher elements of segregated life in America without there being constant negotiation. It's not a simple flat imposition of whites on top of color, it's a series of conversations. If you can find the right black voice or the right black elite to basically narrate what you want as an effective and pragmatic solution to the problem of segregation, you will create the conditions whereby these kinds of projects take place, or how freeways are allowed to become the shade for Under Expressway parks. Right? That project was an interracial coalition. You have arguments about space, less about people, right? So you create the notion that people aren't actually living in this community through your planning document. It's simply invisible or an empty space. Whereas the lived experience on the ground under these demolition efforts is very, very different. I want to share with you one recollection from the experience of urban renewal that comes from a Miami resident. This is taken in an interview in 1997. You couldn't fight it. This is a woman named Maud Newbold. The highway destroyed the cultural, the spiritual, the educational concept of the entire community. We lost our neighbors, we lost our friends, we lost our relatives. It was like death. It destroyed us. Narratives about urban renewal have now largely become narratives about Negro removal. In 1963, the cultural critic and novelist and essayist James Baldwin helped to popularize the phrase Negro removal after a very hot and heavy meeting he had with Bobby Kennedy about the federal government not doing enough for black Americans. He was on a show with Kenneth Clark, who was also at this meeting, and they recorded their conversation. This is Baldwin talking in 1963. Urban renewal means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal, and the federal government is an accomplice to that fact. The Negro removal narrative has become the dominant narrative about displacement. And it's important to think through at least a moment when, even when you had people claiming that they wanted to stop urban renewal or stop the politics of displacement, others were trying to save the program and still believe very much in its benefits. This is the mayor, Carl Stokes of Cleveland, one of many urban mayors who were, again, sitting in the mayor's office when urban renewal projects were taking root. Black activists who were helping to push for the desegregation of schools and buses in the 1950s and 60s were also becoming the spokespeople for urban renewal in the 1960s and 1970s. This is very important. The same people, the same individuals who are helping to spark very inspirational movements against public space and public accommodations are also believing very much in the politics of displacement. You see people making arguments about urban renewal encouraging integration, save urban renewal by referendum votes. And this would seem very confusing if all that you knew about urban renewal was the Negro removal narrative. But what's important to keep in mind, and what makes sense here, and what allows at least for it to make sense, is that you have people believing, that the suburbs were waiting for them if you simply allow the displacement to occur. And this is what I want to basically close on this afternoon. You don't really have, until only very recently, an appreciation of the fact that black people understood the suburbs as being an entitlement for them. In 1948, the Urban League ran a study wherein 3 out of 4 African Americans believed that they wanted to live in the suburbs. They wanted to be in suburban space. They wanted to be free from rats, other kinds of public health crises. And they believed that if you simply allowed for the state to come in and root out landlords, in some ways to root out the politics of paternalism, to allow for greater self-determination, to remove people like Luther Brooks from the equation, then you would create a more equitable society. And you do not get the kind of support that you see for urban renewal without the suburban promise dangling there at the end of that arrangement, at the end of that political equation, right? In most cases, the single black voice that you needed from a local minister or a newspaper editor to support urban renewal usually came from a black suburbanite who was living outside of the neighborhood under the target, under the kind of bulldozer. In 1968, there was a Republican National Convention in Miami, Florida. The convention saw the nomination of Richard Nixon as the great new standard bearer of the GOP. At the very same time, Miami had its first official race riot. The politics of the conference table had seemingly broke down. Poverty was ongoing. Landlords continued to exploit. And it was believed that after the riot of 1968, you had to find a way to try to bring back and to reinstill the promise in the conference table. The promise and the privilege of negotiating interracially had to be preserved as one of the options on the table. One of the things that I love about this image is that it actually shows that the riot in 1968 was not an urban riot. It was a suburban riot. After all of the belief in suburban spaces, there was a downward mobility of black suburbs across the South and West, where landlords built new concrete tenements in those old suburban neighborhoods. Zoning broke down and poverty ensued. And you have moments like this at the Under Expressway Park happening in these inner city neighborhoods, where you mostly just have the folks who are there trying to salvage a sense of interracial compromise, who are coming from the suburbs and showing up for the photo ops, right? And part of what I try to think about, and hopefully we can think about together, as a moment of interracial compromise marking the civil rights movement, is this back and forth between elites, black elites and white elites, while the black poor look on oftentimes without shirt or without shoes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our next speaker is Ty Jones, who has just taken over as a historical curator at the Columbia University Library. He's the author of 2 books. His first book, A Radical Line from the Labor Movement to the Weather Underground, is a dual biography of his parents, Jeff Jones and Eleanor Raskin, both of whom were members of the Weather Underground and leaders of the Weather Underground. And his new book is more powerful than dynamite: Radicals, Plutocrats, Progressives, and New York's Year of Anarchy, about the year 1914. I'm sure that Professor Jones is tired of hearing this, but in my view, his father, Jeff Jones, who he's going to talk about, is someone who actually saved the country from a disastrous thing in May of 1970, when he and Bernardine Dorn, eventually supported by Bill Ayers, said, okay, sorry, I get to hear it twice. I'm sure that Professor Jones is tired of hearing this, but in my view, his father, Jeff Jones, and Bernardine Dorn, supported eventually by Bill Ayers, saved the country from a disastrous situation in May of 1970 by foregoing lethal bombing by weatherman, which would have brought down upon the country the wrath of Richard Nixon in a way that we cannot imagine. So I can, since I've seen the wrath that was already there without the lethal bombing. And that in doing so, he saved the country both from weatherman and the Weather Underground, and from the government. And at the end of that, why the government might be listening to all of us today. Okay, so
They're certainly listening.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Thank you especially to Professor Eckstein, who brought us all here together today. We're here to talk about our work and our projects, but I'm interested as we begin to think about why some of you are here. So I thought I would just ask a question to the audience first, which is, why are you here? Or to ask it in a different way, what interests you about the idea of the New Left in black and white? Yeah.
History is like one of my favorite classes. It's like one of my favorite subjects, and especially like the 1960s, I think it's like one of the most interesting times, and like something I always wanted to learn more about. So I thought this was a really good opportunity.
Right. So for people who are interested, she's interested in history, and the 1960s are one of the most interesting times, and I certainly agree, and that's really what I'll be talking about today. So I think I'll start, and if there are things that we talked about that people don't know about, specific organizations, I mean, I doubt that everyone here knows who the Weathermen are or the Weather Underground, although some might. Please let me know. In October 1969, my father, Jeff Jones, who you just heard about, led a militant faction of mostly white anti-war activists known as the Weathermen into a series of violent demonstrations in Chicago. As much as anyone else, the protests were his idea. He had worked for months to plan them and promote them, and he was in fact in the front rank of the march when it finally left the park on the first night of the demonstrations. Then for almost a week, day after day and night after night, they rampaged, quite literally, through the city in a protest that would become infamous as the Days of Rage. Wearing football helmets, armed with baseball bats and hockey sticks, they set fires, vandalized property, and engaged the police in violent hand-to-hand combat. Reports of these demonstrations were in all the newspapers. They were on the evening news. CBS News reporter was on the scene in downtown Chicago. They smashed countless windows on the city's near north side, the TV told the Nation. It seemed to be violence for violence's sake, with the radicals making no specific demands. In fact, the radicals had numerous demands and numerous motivations behind this extremely confrontational, unusually confrontational protest tactic. But first among their motivations was always the goal of supporting the Black liberation struggle and demonstrating unity and solidarity among what they usually called the Black and brown peoples of the world. My father, thinking back, said the point of the Days of Rage was that if they're going to continue to attack the Vietnamese and to kill the Black Panthers, then we as young white people are going to attack them behind the lines. That's why we smashed up people's private property and fought the cops. The situation was so grave, what the U.S. was doing, that we had to take extreme measures. In the months of lead up to the march, my father, Jeff, had worked quite closely with a young man named Fred Hampton, who was a rising superstar of the anti-war movement and who was the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago. And they met with him repeatedly and were quite desperate, really, for him to approve of the tactics that they were using in the Days of Rage. In fact, he denounced it in the strongest words possible. We believe that the Weatherman action is anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic, and that its leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred. And they call that revolution. That's nothing but child play. It's folly. So my talk today is really going to focus on this disagreement. What could have possibly inspired, on the one hand, this group of middle-class white Americans to go on their rampage through a major American city, and on the other hand, what lay behind Chairman Fred Hampton and the other Panthers' skepticism of this action. And to tell this story, I will use the story of my father as sort of a trope. He was born after World War II, and he grew up in Southern California, a real all-American boy. Actually, he was the second best boy in all of San Fernando Valley, according to the competition for local youths in 1963. He lived in the suburbs. His father worked for the Walt Disney Company. My dad was a YMCA camp counselor, a varsity athlete. He was the senior class president at his high school. And he had been raised as a Quaker, the major part of his childhood that did not fit the usual narrative. And as a Quaker, he believed deeply in nonviolence. His own father had refused to fight in World War II, and that was a very courageous thing to do at that time, or some would say a very dubious thing to do, but a controversial thing, certainly. But he and Jeff were committed to the Democratic Party. They went door-to-door campaigning for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And when he began his freshman year at Antioch College in the fall of 1965, his life's plan was to go into Democratic Party politics. If everything worked out well, he would be a congressman from California, and people who knew him I was confident that that's what he would do. So this is him in 1965, and here he is in 1969. So, what do you think these pictures reveal? What had happened to him in the interim to make this type of dramatic transformation possible? Yeah?
College.
College. Absolutely. And not just any college experience, but college in the midst of incredibly tumultuous time on American campuses. In fact, Jeff went to his first anti-war demonstration in his very first weeks as a freshman in college, and before long he actually dropped out of college to commit himself full-time to the movement. What else? Yeah?
Music.
Absolutely. These are the years of the great rock and roll that we know and love. By 1969, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, for instance, had exploded on the scene and were themselves less than a year from their own death. What else? Yeah.
The Vietnam War was escalating.
That's right. And these are all parts of the answer. And it all has to do with what we heard before. What's interesting about the 60s is the incredibly accelerated history that occurs in this time. This is a 4-year period, and yet between these two pictures, 48,320 Americans had been killed in Vietnam, including 7 of Jeff's classmates out of 80 male seniors in his class. 7 had died in Vietnam by then. The Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland, California. Massive and major street demonstrations had occurred all across the country, including at the Pentagon and in the Chicago 1968 during the Democratic National Convention. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Students had taken over and shut down more than 500 college campuses. In cities across the country, we just saw Miami, but also in Detroit, Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and New York City, African Americans participated in massive rebellions, which the mainstream press usually called riots, in protest of living conditions, police brutality, and a lack of economic opportunities. Jeff had also discovered marijuana, which he smoked copiously and daily, although he claims that he would never smoke until after his days organizing was over. But all of this was in the course of just 4 short years, which when you think about how little has happened in the past 4 years, is a remarkable idea. Just imagine the compression of history in those times. After he dropped out of college, he became he joined an organization called the Students for a Democratic Society. Has anyone here heard of the Students for a Democratic Society? Would anyone care to say a few words about the group? Well, I would say it was certainly one of the most important student organizations in American history. In 1965, when my dad joined it, it was actually a rather small group that had formed in the Midwest. But by 1969, it was an enormous organization with over 100,000 paying members and with probably 5 to 10 times as many loyal readers of the newsletter and participants in the demonstrations. A few years later, Jeff became a national officer of this organization, one of 3 national officers. So he was in every sense a leader of this group. He was one of the very first people from the student movement to travel to Vietnam. There's a picture of him at the far left. He actually didn't quite make it to Vietnam because the U.S.'s bombing campaign in North Vietnam had made travel impossible. But every day throughout these years, he had woken up and asked himself, what am I doing? What can I do to end the war in Vietnam? And yet, after years and years of this constant protest, when millions of people like him had been demonstrating against the war, and as polls showed that most people were losing faith in the Vietnam War, nothing had affected the nation's policies. In fact, more and more troops had been deployed. Troop levels had risen even higher than before. The war was spreading. Landmark civil rights legislation had failed to solve crises in inner city neighborhoods. So in other words, all of his tactics to date had done very little to change what he thought had to be done. And that's when he conceived of the idea of the Days of Rage in Chicago. The Days of Rage would be a different type of protest, a protest that would be even more militant than before, more confrontational than anything before. And in this article, you can see Jeff wrote this article. He says, "We must move swiftly and effectively to rectify our mistakes. The Vietnamese and the black and brown struggles for liberation here need the support of a militant, fighting, anti-imperialist youth movement." To prepare themselves for this moment of confrontation, the members of Weatherman spent months stealing their nerve. They jogged in the parks, they practiced karate, they picked fights, they kicked people out who they felt weren't committed enough. They trained themselves, they read manuals in People's Warfare. They ate the same food that Vietnamese soldiers ate. They ate lots of rice. They slept all together on bare mattresses on the floor in the most Spartan of conditions. And they viciously criticized anyone who they felt did not live up to their own standards of commitment. One of my father's most embarrassing moments, which unfortunately was for him, was commemorated in this graphic novel written by Harvey Picard. He went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and took over the stage from a local SDS meeting and insulted everyone in the audience, demanding that they join him in Chicago for the Days of Rage protests. And this is him. Anyone who doesn't go is a wimp. And all together in unison, the entire audience turned their chairs around and faced the other direction against him. It was possible in America, and it still is possible, to be a radical and also to have a good career, a nice house, a healthy marriage, a secure income, and even to be a popular celebrity. Many lawyers, doctors, university professors, actors, and labor leaders have done it. But Weatherman said that this was wrong. These options were not available to the Black Panthers or to the Young Lords, which was a Hispanic gang, protest gang in mostly New York, and they were certainly not possible for the people of Vietnam. No sacrifice could be enough to prove that they had shed their comfortable middle-class instincts and had turned into a new type of person who would be capable of carrying out the type of revolutionary activity that they believed was possible. All of this very extreme activity was required for these young people, college students, or at this time college graduates, to prepare themselves to break out of what I'm calling in this talk their liberal subjecthood, the strictures, the restraints with which they had been raised. This generation was raised largely in the 1950s, an era which we remember as a period of conformity, and perhaps that made it even more difficult to imagine engaging in the type of protests that they were suddenly calling for at the end of 1969. But I wonder, does this seem foreign to people here? Can anyone here imagine the effort, the moral, psychological effort required to abandon the types of mores that you were raised with in order to fight for a cause that you thought was worth fighting for?
I think things have to be taken into context because things are a lot better now. There's still racism and injustices done throughout the country, but it's not as widespread and as plastered all over the media. People
harder today. You can imagine even more of a kind of self-transformation necessary. I mean, we saw a few years ago during the Occupy Wall Street protests, people who were going through this type of transformation. And a lot of the people who were involved in that protest were people who had had the middle class dream stolen from them and who felt like the middle class, subject to the middle class opportunities, no longer existed for them. But there was nothing that Weatherman did that was more difficult than overcoming this internalized upbringing. And they had a word for it. They described it as the enemy within. And all of their attempts at self-discipline in 1969, living in poverty, physical training, and outrageous provocations pointed at the same dilemma. Their mottos, if you looked at them in this context, speak directly to it. Smash monogamy was one of them. Eat your parents was another one. And their most notorious action was a celebration of Charles Manson during the period when Manson was committing his string of murders. So all of these outrageous actions were a very public attempt to separate themselves from their upbringing. Best example of this is a story I once heard about a group of them who were staying with supporters, and one of the weathermen began drinking the milk right from the carton of these people's refrigerator. And another one said, "You gotta stop that because we're gonna alienate these people and these people are our friends." And he said, "I ain't no liberal," and he finished drinking the milk. And so for Weatherman, it was about being no liberal. In Chicago, Jeff worked hand in hand with Fred Hampton, and he witnessed as Hampton and the Chicago Panthers felt increasing pressure and violence from the police. And his dream for the Days of Rage is that the violence of the state was transferred from African American communities onto the white protesters, and that's why he imagined it as being in support of these people. As I showed, though, Chairman Fred was disgusted by the plan. He was certain that the protesters' tactics would ricochet onto the black community, believing that the Days of Rage would in fact result in the destruction of African Americans across Chicago. And in their last meeting before the demonstration, Fred Hampton actually kicked the Weathermen leaders out of the Black Panther office and threw them down the stairs of a building, a very old, very steep staircase, and sent them on their way. In the demonstrations, Jeff charged for about 100 yards or so through a police line. One police officer tried to punch him, another one swung for his head with a club. Jeff had been a track star in high school. He dodged through the line, took a left into a blind alleyway, and was surrounded by undercover policemen who arrested him. And that was the end of his Days of Rage protest. He was bailed out the next morning. The Days of Rage ended with 100 Weathermen under arrest, and really it was an organizational disaster. The mass rally that they had hoped for had in fact not occurred. Only a few hundred people showed up, and the insistence on discipline had alienated almost everybody in the movement. But in one way, their predictions had proved correct. The police rage had focused on white activists, and the Black Panthers in Chicago had experienced a brief moment of respite from the attention of the cops. And Jeff and Fred Hampton worked together again after the march. And about a month after the Days of Rage, they spoke together on a radio talk show. And Jeff drove Fred home, and they argued on the way home about the role of African Americans in the revolution. And Jeff was much more optimistic than Chairman Fred. And then less than a week later, on December 4th, 1969, Fred Hampton was slipped a sleeping pill by an FBI informant, and a few hours later, a squad of the Chicago Police Department burst into the apartment, Fred Hampton's apartment, and executed him while he slept. The murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago was the final warning for Weathermen. They went underground, meaning that they changed their names, they disappeared from sight, they went into hiding. My father, Jeff, would spend the next 11 years as a fugitive from justice. And the Weather Underground, for people who don't know, claimed a campaign of symbolic bombings against targets across the United States, including the U.S. Capitol building, the Pentagon, and New York City Police headquarters. And although 3 of their own members were killed when one of these bombings failed, no one that they targeted, no one was ever killed by the bombs that they had constructed. They were incredibly careful not to hurt people. That's a pretty fine distinction, but it was a distinction that really was the product of Jeff's upbringing as a Quaker and his commitment to some form of nonviolence. But what I think is important here is to say that the option that the Weathermen had of going underground was not really available to black or Hispanic activists. Although the FBI obsessed about the weather underground, it dedicated itself to the total eradication of black activism. This slide shows some, and not all, of the members of the Black Panther Party who were killed either by police or in confrontations with other activists that had been spurred on by police provocation. In 1968 and 1969, 28 members of the Black Panthers were killed by police. And this, I think, speaks to why Fred Hampton's vision of the Days of Rage was so different from Jeff's. Looking at this slide, what does it say to us about why Fred Hampton might have had a slightly more dubious notion of the tactics of the Days of Rage? What do we see? Yeah. Sorry? That's right. I mean, they're all incredibly young. I mean, Fred Hampton himself was 21. But what's important here is that the scale of violence against black activists is qualitatively different than it is against the Weathermen. 8 people were shot during the Days of Rage, although none was killed. If you compare that to the uprisings in American cities, 43 people were killed in Detroit in 1967, 34 in Watts, 28 in Newark. And these are the types of numbers that Fred Hampton was thinking about when he was imagining the Weather Underground adventure into downtown Chicago. The afterlife of the Black New Left, in other words, is a much darker story than the aftermath of the Weather Underground, with many cases of drug abuse, imprisonment, and tragedy. And since I'm not in any way qualified to be a spokesman for them, I think I'll just take a minute to let some of their voices speak for themselves. This is Assata Shakur, who was a leader of the Black Liberation Army, who escaped from prison in the 1970s and now lives in exile in Cuba, where I spoke to her, and Assata told me about what the experience of the Black New Left has meant for the next generation. A lot of what happened to children of revolutionaries depended on the amount of resources available, the support and consciousness of extended families, she says, and then she goes on, there's not enough support, there's not enough help. In prison, underground, they suffer and continue to suffer. She goes on, I'm gonna skip that. Geronimo Pratt was framed for a murder and spent 27 years in prison until 1997 when he was exonerated and released. And I talked to his son, Hiroji, who was a freshman in college when I talked to him, and he says, that's what we needed back then, was people like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X to fight back against racism. So he's still endorsing the types of actions that his father had taken, despite the toll that it took on their lives. Amani Davis's father, Jomo Davis, was in Attica. He was the leader of the Black Panthers in Attica prison, and he spent almost her entire childhood in jail. And she is an activist herself, and she talks about how the lessons of this period really suggest that a new strategy is needed now. Let's die for this shit is certainly not the first thing I'm trying to do, she says. I was born in 1977 when we were still underground. Here we are in disguise. That's Jeff in the mustache. He was arrested in 1981, and because many of the charges against him had been dropped due to FBI malfeasance, he only spent a few weeks in prison and then was on parole for about a year and a half. He had wanted to be a congressman, but he spent almost 20 years of his life in these protests, and now he lives in upstate New York, and he is a environmental lobbyist and activist. He probably would not want me to show you this picture, so there he is, looking a little bit more tough. All right, thank you very much.
So we've had some discussion of compromise and complexity as part of the 60s, and some discussion of absolute radicalism as part of the 60s. And I think the most shocking thing to think about it is, in fact, the afterlife of Weatherman compared to the afterlife of the Panthers. Lots and lots of Weathermen are teachers, lawyers, university professors, not me, but there are some who really are. They don't end up, they have ended up in prison. And the other thing to say is 28 Panthers were killed, no Weathermen were ever killed. And you can ask yourself, well, why did that happen? And I think that's a fair question. That's a fair question to ask. Our third speaker, Professor Mark Naison, is, I think, going to kind of go the middle route and emphasizing his own individual journey through racism and good relations, and Weatherman and dropping out of Weatherman, and getting all that crap that Ty was talking about thrown at him, that really happened, including smash monogamy. He's going to present a individualist thing, and let me just say that he's written many books, but my favorite title so far is his latest book, is Badass Teachers Unite. Okay, Professor Naison.
I don't need a microphone. Okay, so fascinated by the earlier talks. I don't use PowerPoint because I'm old school. I'm also old. But this talk is kind of about why I didn't go to the Day of Rage, even though I knew Ty's mother extremely well from high school and from the movement, and ended up to be the first white person ever hired in a Black Studies department, which has been my life ever since. And part of the reason, as I will tell you this story, is I wasn't middle class. I wasn't suburban, and I came to the movement from a very different Brooklyn upbringing. Now, I've written about what I'm going to talk to you about through a book called White Boy, a Memoir, which was published about 12 years ago, but there's some kind of new elements that I'm adding to the story because of the research I've done in recent years on popular culture and popular music. My most popular course at Fordham is called From Rock and Roll to Hip Hop. And this is probably the first lecture that I'm giving where I won't be rapping. But I think that when we're talking about stories which are not in the mainstream, that are shaping history, I'm going to talk about things in my upbringing which shape my views of race, which are almost never talked about, because they're not explicitly political, but may have been more important than the political things. So this is going to be a little bit of a memoir story with reflections on different influences that not only shape me, but shape many other people, although my stories has some idiosyncratic elements. So I grew up in a lower middle class family in a Jewish and Italian working class neighborhood in Brooklyn, which had a handful of black families. My parents, school teachers who were second generation immigrants, were strong trade union supporters, but were probably classified as liberal social democrats. They came from a tradition which saw all workers as having common interest, but which did not emphasize the fight against anti-black racism in the United States as a moral commitment equal to that fighting for workers' rights. This led to a series of complicated negotiations they had with race as it was lived. To start with, my parents never ever used the word nigger. And this is in the 1950s, and if I had used it, they would have washed my mouth off with salt. They despised Southern racists who denied blacks their constitutional rights and spoke very highly of black leaders like Martin Luther King, who took the moral and intellectual high ground in fighting for civil rights. But at the same time, they regularly used the term Schwarzes. How many of you have heard this term? If you grew up in New York around Jews, you will hear it. And not in a flattering way to refer to black people who lived, worked, and went to school in New York City, and periodically had conversations in Yiddish, a language which I did not understand, when referring to those mysterious individuals. In their personal dealings with African Americans, they seemed to be fair and decent, and occasionally more than that. But there was no question that there was a deep undercurrent of resentment, contempt, confusion in the discussions they were having in Yiddish about black people as a collective entity, something I would come to understand more when I became an adolescent and showed an interest in civil rights. So that's sort of my parents. On the face of it, they're liberal civil rights supporters, but there's this undercurrent of resentment towards black people in Brooklyn as a whole who are now coming closer and closer to our neighborhood. However, there was another influence in me, which I think in retrospect may have been even more important, which was popular culture, and where the dominant influences were sports and music, each in forms that were commercially marketed to totally dominate the lives and horizons of working class boys and male adolescents in the highly gendered world of post-war Brooklyn. And this is something I don't hear people talk about, is what it was like growing up in Brooklyn in 1953, 54, 55, 56, and being bombarded with images in television and also sounds in the radio, which projected what in retrospect were a totally insurgent, even revolutionary view of what America was. And let me first go through sports. Okay, I'm a jock. I'm a ball player. That's why I need hip replacements. But 6 years old, I'm watching the Friday night fights with my grandpa, who's actually was a Union thug, Grandpa Charlie. So I'm watching Kid Gavilan and Ezra Charles and Joe Louis against Rocky Marciano, and this is my Friday night. Then I'm 7 blocks from Ebbets Field, and they're the Dodgers in television. There's Jackie Robinson and Don Newcomb and Roy Campanella, and then there's the Giants, and there's Willie Mays. Have you ever seen how Willie Mays caught a ball? A basket catch? Do you know how hard it is to catch a baseball this way? And to catch it better than anybody who ever played center field? I'm looking at every kid in my neighborhood's looking at this one. This is amazing. But then it's basketball. The NBA is on. And there's Bill Russell, who is blocking, and then Elgin Baylor. That's when we realized that somebody could go to the basket and jump high enough to triple pump before putting a shot in our basketball crazed neighborhood. Then there's the National Football League, the New York Giants, Roosevelt Greer and Roosevelt Brown. And not only that, there's every high school basketball game is televised. And in New York City, that means they're black players with white players on the court. This is the images that I am bombarded with on television. This is, to me, the America I want to be part of, because I knew I was a ball player from the time I was 8 years old. And to, you know, and this was me. And so it's that. And I'm seeing this. No one is ever mentioning that this is revolutionary. Nobody is ever talking about race. But in my neighborhood, which is 90% Jewish and Italian, 10% Irish and black, we're doing this every day, trying to imitate these people. We want to be on television too, you know, and that's our dream. That enough would be a pretty goddamn important thing. But then there's rock and roll. Hey, toom, baba, toom, baba, toom. 1956, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers come out with Why Do Fools Fall in Love? And all of a sudden, 5th grade at PS 91, we're having rock and roll parties. Where we have girls over putting on these little records, go kissing games in the closet, but it's all like rock and roll swept through our neighborhood. And see, you know, we knew about Elvis, we knew about Jerry Lee Lewis, we knew about Little Richard, we knew about, Fats Domino, but for us it was the singing groups of New York, the urban harmonic groups. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, the Drifters, Little Anthony and the Imperials, all New Yorkers. They were all black. And these were the formative influences on me as a working class, lower middle class kid growing up in Brooklyn. These were I wanted to be a ball player, I wanted to be a singer. And every other kid in my neighborhood did. And this was, here's the thing. This is going on, and nobody is talking about the political implications of this, because this is the McCarthy era. And you have to be very careful about saying anything which seems to suggest that you're protesting anything. So you're any of you ever read the great book, The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn, about covering the Jackie Robinson Dodgers? He was not allowed to ever write about race. Race was being put at us in this incendiary form, and no one was talking about it. Nobody was explaining it. There was no language to deal with it. There was no connection in the media. And you're talking about 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids. And this is a revolution, and no one is controlling it because it's all entrepreneurship, people trying to make money. I mean, part of the study that I've done of the early years of rock and roll is what basically happened was that there was this incredible music being produced in post-war urban black communities where you had a lot of people with money in their pockets for the first time because they were unionized workers, and there were radio stations which decided there's money to be made to cater to this market, and these little record labels which did the same thing. The only problem is when you play music in the airwaves, you can't segregate it. So the stores selling records in the black community suddenly discovered half the people buying them are young whites. And then a couple of clever people, one of the most famous of which is Alan Freed, decides to say, oh boy, I can market this. Let's call it rock and roll, market it to everybody, and it swept through the country. So here is this amazing experience that I'm having, which is normalizing the idea of blacks and whites who are, singing together, playing ball together, and creating this incredibly exciting America. And I bought it lock, stock, and barrel as an up-and-coming athlete. Now, my parents had none of this experience. So here's the thing. My neighborhood in Brooklyn is becoming more and more black as Bedford-Stuyvesant expands into Crown Heights, and my parents are getting angry and angrier, and I'm getting more and more excited at the idea of entering high school and maybe getting on television myself. So a lot of it comes to a head in a very interesting way. My parents are a little bit nuts about academics. They made me skip 2 grades, which meant I had to fight all the time. So I enter high school as a 13-year-old sophomore at Wingate High School. And believe it or not, I was a tennis player and a pretty good one, and so I was going to be a star in their team. I couldn't make their basketball team, which I wanted to, but whatever. But they put me in a gym class, you know, with a lot of kids who were athletes. And I was like, at that point, 5'6" and immature and wore glasses. Actually, maybe 5'4". Next year is when I grew. And there were 6 kids on the track team who took one look at me, all black kids, and they said, let's tease this baby here. What they didn't realize is I was crazy. So they kept teasing me. And then one of them said, tie my shoelace. I said, fuck you. So they knocked me out cold. But here's the thing. I just wanted to go back the next day because I didn't say, oh, these are black kids. It's just another fight and I lost. But to my parents, it was one more, you know, nail in the coffin of a changing. So they made me transfer to another high school outside of the district called Erasmus Hall High School, which had higher academic standards and fewer black kids. So I get there, and I actually get in a fight with 2 Irish kids who I killed. And then, so that was that. And made the tennis team. And then I discovered something very interesting. In my honors classes, there were these kids who, in retrospect, we call red diaper babies. They were children of people who had been in or near the Communist Party. And they had this, they were, first of all, they were already political activists. They had they had a peace organization, the Student Peace Union. They had a little group of Congress of Racial Equality. And I was very intrigued by this. They also had, you know, one of them was Ty's mother, Eleanor, and then Eleanor Stein. So even though my primary identity was as an athlete and a rock and roller, I started hanging out with them, always feeling a little different. First of all, they were richer than I was. So this is ironic. The children of communists are the rich kids. You know, some of them actually lived in private houses or nice apartments. You know, but they were cool. And then they introduced me to this music I'd never heard before. Paul Robeson, Josh White, Odetta, Sonny Terry, and Brownie McGee. They had this whole analysis of, you know, that racism was this profound flaw of American society that had to be dealt with if there would be any progress that was going to be made. And I thought it gave a language for what I was experiencing. But on the other hand, they were living segregated lives, whereas I wasn't. I was on a tennis team. My doubles partner, we won the city championship, was black. The kids I played at Lincoln Terrace Park, the kids, I was living this kind of, you know, working class, integrated life. And they were the ones fighting racism from this middle class vantage point. But they were right. But they were strange to me. So so I started hanging out with them, and I still remember one great incident of where Eleanor's mother, Annie Stein, took a bunch of us from Columbia Corps to meet this great African-American leader in Bed-Stuy, Thomas Russell Jones, as part of a movement to boycott Ebbinger's, this great racist bakery in Brooklyn, which made this amazing blackout cake, but wouldn't hire blacks as drivers and salespersons. So I ended up in my first demonstration, at which point my parents go completely nuts and say, why are you doing things for the Schwarzes? Why aren't you helping the Jews? And they just went off on how black people were ruining their Brooklyn. And something turned cold in me at that point, and I realized, no, there's something immoral about your attitude, but also you don't speak to my experience. My whole identity as a working class guy growing up as an athlete in Brooklyn was totally identified with blacks and whites playing together and with me, my black role models as an athlete. So here I go off to college, and right now I am radicalized, but I'm not sure how to do it. So the first thing I do when I get to Columbia is go out for teams. Again, I make the tennis team easily, and I get cut from the basketball team. It's probably a source of much trauma I kept getting cut. I didn't join a civil rights group then, partly because I thought I might fail out of Columbia if I didn't actually do some work, which was almost true. But also, I was having a lot of fun with being part of this sort of jock circle. I got two things out of the jock circle. One is there were actually black students in that circle, because there were, at that point in my entering class, there were 6 black students out of 660. You know, in entering in 62. And 4 of them were athletes, and I became friends with a couple of them. The other thing was that there were a lot of Southerners on the wrestling and football team who were part of the circle, and I ended up realizing how much I was identified with living in a multiracial and interracial life. They would argue all the time, oh my God, if we integrate, then they're going to want to marry my sister. You know, and I said, cool. I ended up saying, my life shows that when blacks and whites go to school together, play ball together, hang out together, the most wonderful kind of things happen. You know, for me, and it wasn't, for me it was sports and rock and roll, but it was my identity was centered in this Brooklyn experience of multiracial interaction and also this popular culture immersion. Then my sophomore year, I finally decided to do something. After seeing the March in Washington in television, I end up deciding to go to Columbia Corps. And goddamn it, it's just like Erasmus Corps. It's an all-white group of middle-class kids who are super hip. I mean, they're very, very cool, but they're not like the kids in my neighborhood. So, but again, they're right. I want to be part of them. So I volunteer not to do anything in campus, but to go to East Harlem to do tenant organizing. And that was an amazing experience. Going into East Harlem, which was predominantly at that point Puerto Rican and black with a handful of white families, organizing a building. The people there were like a notch economically below the people in my neighborhood, but they were familiar to me. And the music and the food, listening to, the music, the smell of the cuchifritos, this was, and I felt again connected, and that added to my, kind of identity as my anti-racism was going to be in this experience of working class, ethnic people mingling their cultures together. And I didn't know what to do with this because no one else I knew felt the way I did. This was not the experience of most people in Columbia Corps. But I knew I had to find my own path. So the next thing that happened, I decided that I was going to become a history major and that whenever I did research, I was going to do it on African American history and race. And so in my junior year at college, I meet this great professor, Walter Metzger, and I write these 50-page papers, one on the disfranchisement of African Americans in Alabama at the turn of the century, the other about education and segregation in the South in the 1940s. And I said, okay, I'm going to become a historian, so now I have another ball juggling. I'm an athlete, I'm a, kind of a neighborhood guy, I'm a historian, but all of this paled before the most formative experience in my life, which is in my senior year. I'm at a basketball team party, I meet and fall in love with this, Jeff knows her, this utterly gorgeous African-American woman, and I end up falling in love with her, and I get kicked out of my family. However, getting kicked out of my family at a time when I had fellowship offers to a number of universities so I could tell my parents, good. But I also was adopted by my girlfriend's extended family. They were from Georgia to New York, and once again, I found myself more comfortable in this sort of black working class family than I did in the cocktail parties of the Columbia History Department. So here I am, the movement is taking off, and I'm trying to figure out, how do you maneuver after 1966 when you have a white movement and a black movement, and I'm living this multiracial life? What the hell do I do? You know, fortunately, because I was part of a black family and because my ball playing experiences, I never severed my ties from the black community. This was my home life. This is Christmas. This is the holidays. This is birthdays. You know, this is dancing to Joe Tex, who most white people never heard of. How many of you have heard of Joe Tex? Jesus, look him up. It's a soul singer from the 60s. I mean, you know Otis Redding, you know James Brown. Joe Tex is a little more, okay, anyway. I'm in graduate school at Columbia, and then the Columbia strike takes place, and it's a little bit traumatic for me when, after we occupy the first building, the black students basically feel the white students aren't tough enough, so they tell them to leave, and they take other buildings, including Jeff your father was in mathematics? Right. Okay, here is my girlfriend in the building. So I end up helping organize a goon squad of radical athletes and neighborhood teenagers to keep the football players from, from boycotting the buildings and getting the food in. But the point is that I became acutely uncomfortable with this division of movements into a black movement and a white movement. You couldn't separate. For me, you separate me from the black community, it's like you cut the soul out of me. I'm no longer who I am, and so there was a very interesting moment, and I'll get this to you guys, when I like the idea of militancy. I like the idea of bringing the war home. I like the idea of making the authorities have to pay attention to white radicals causing trouble and taking the heat off black revolutionaries. I like that. So I sort of hung with the weather people for a while until this idea of smashing monogamy came across. So here I am. They say, we have to smash monogamy. That means you have to break up with any relationship that's serious, marriage or love. So, okay, you're telling me to break up with a black woman to undermine white skin privilege after I've gotten kicked out of my family? Fuck you! And because I was known as being crazy, they just said, leave him alone. But otherwise, I would have probably, but I ended up feeling, I don't care what you all were saying. I always felt the white left, I loved them, I respected them, but they were middle class, they were a cut above me, and they didn't have that Brooklyn experience. And I had to go with my heart and my friendships. So I did what everybody said you couldn't do. I stayed in a black family, and then when I was applying for teaching jobs, and by this time I had a felonious assault arrest and had
Why don't you explain the felonious assault?
Oh God. We can do that later. There was a famous thing called the Cheeseburger 11 when we had karate practice in Prospect Park when I was still with the Weathermen, and then we went into a restaurant. They wouldn't serve us because they said we looked like hippies. We said we wouldn't leave. They brought the cops in. We handcuffed the cops and held them helpless like babies. Then 4 squad cars came with guns drawn and beat the shit out of us in the station house. So, okay, that was the way, yeah. Anyway. Isn't this what history professors all do? I said, okay, here, I had 2 possibilities for jobs. There were free community colleges which offered me jobs teaching American history and world history. And then I was playing basketball in Riverside Park. And a white kid from the neighborhood I had mentored, who was a basketball player, said, Mark, my black history professor at Fordham says there's a job offer. why don't you apply? So I said, oh, what the hell? I said, first, I sent this letter, it said, first of all, I'm white. And if that disqualifies me, that's cool, I understand. But if not, I've done X, Y, and Z. So they interviewed me and then offered me the job. So I said, hell yeah. Okay, I would much rather be the one white person in a black studies department wherever than with a bunch of crew-cut white guys having me teach, you know, introductory history. And I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I've been doing that ever since. And the thing is, when you're looking at race in the 60s, you have to look at class and popular culture too. In some ways, I guess in a lot of ways, I felt more like Fred Hampton than your dad, because I grew up a little more like Fred in terms of neighborhoods. And your dad is a hero, but Fred is a martyr, and Fred is still a lifeline to me. So, you know, thank you very much, and let's talk.
Thank you, Mark. Believe me, he's got a lot more story. Let's talk. Who has questions that they want?
Oh, yes. This is the Badass Teachers Association, the fastest growing education activist organization in the country. 30,000 angry teachers fighting against excessive testing in the schools.
You always like that.
I can have a fat tattoo, baby. So.
Okay, who's got questions? Who wants to ask?
Can you elaborate on the reference to that you made regarding the gentleman on the far left about saving the country?
Basically, as I understand things, in the winter of 1970, that is January, February, March of 1970, Weatherman really planned an extended bombing campaign that would have involved killing a lot of people. This wasn't all of Weatherman, it was the East Coast Weatherman, and Jeff was on the West Coast, and he had a different view of things, and was, I'm pretty influenced by counterculture stuff as well. I have to say, I grew up in North Hollywood High, which is like 15 miles from Simcoe, so, yeah. If that had gone forward, and 3 people were killed anyway because the bomb blew up in their faces, but if that had gone forward, many, many people would have been killed. And the result of that would have been that the government would have come down like a ton of bricks on all kinds of leftist groups. As it was, they were pretty bad, but nothing compared to what would have happened in terms of, I think, murders and killings on both sides. And therefore, it was crucial in May of 1970, during Cambodia and Kent State, this enormous student insurrection, that the Weather Underground wasn't then. So Weatherman came to the leadership debated about whether they should continue lethal bombing. Now, all bombing is technically lethal. All bombing can be lethal. The Pentagon bomb missed killing a cleaning lady by a few minutes. So I mean, it's all possible. But they didn't intend to kill anybody, and they didn't intend to injure anybody after that. And that meant, I mean, there are a whole variety of things that means. That means, one thing, they were protected by their supporters because nobody felt they were doing anything really wrong. So the FBI never caught them. On the other side of it, once everything was finished and they came up or were sort of arrested, they got off incredibly light. A lot of charges were dropped because of FBI malfeasance. But the result was that this is a discussion about the benefits of amnesty. All of these folks that were in weather, which were very, very radical, have ended up leading productive lives in the past 40 years, although it may seem anticlimactic after the things that happened, as happened to war veterans, that it seems anticlimactic. The most obvious example being Brian Flanagan, who Richard Nixon was told intended to assassinate him. This was in November 1969. Flanagan now owns a bar in Manhattan and won $20,000 on Jeopardy. So that's that, and that point of that story, of course, he doesn't, and he's not actually as remorseful as he says, as appears on the documentary. But the refraining from that kind of violence was very important for the whole development of the country. That's what I'm saying. And if they had done that violence, the response would have been what happened in Germany with the Baader-Meinhof gang, real killing of 50 people. That would have happened. So that, I mean, I'm not the person that you can all talk to me because I'm here all the time. So that's what happened. And I shouldn't, of course, since I'm deep involved in the show, of course everybody knows what we're talking about. You're lucky I didn't start talking about the difference between the national office and progressive labor. Okay, so other questions?
Art.
Yeah.
Mark's girlfriend was one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Mark doesn't give himself credit. I lived in an apartment on the stairs with him, and I knew a lot of those people. The reason that I think you and I didn't go to the Days of Rage is because we were much, much, much smarter than the people who did. People who did, a lot of the most famous people were very, very stupid. They told a lot of lies about the war in Vietnam. They told a lot of lies about the United States. There's almost nothing in New Left Notes of those years that's true. And when you get into the midst of that kind of a world, and everything seems to fit together so well, and your father was one of the main problems, then it's very difficult to get outside and see things clearly. The reason that Jeff Jones and other people wanted to run down those streets and break things was because by 1969, they had become communists with a small c. And they wanted the communists to win the war in Vietnam. And one of the things, I heard Fred Hampton speak at the University of Wisconsin. And one of the things that I hold against us, and a lot of white middle-class radicals, is cheering on Fred Hampton when he said the most ridiculous things about how to improve things in this country. A lot of those Black Panthers that died might not have died if the white left had cheered on and told them how brave and fantastic they all were by picking up the gun and trying to off the pigs. That was a period of reform in the Johnson administration. Things were getting better. And what did the left wing of SDS and what did the Panthers say? That the United States was a fascist country? That the government was repressive? That reform was impossible? Mark, you didn't decide, I think, and I remember our conversations, not to go to Chicago just because you were a working class kid from Brooklyn and you were, believed in integration and all these upper class white kids were just full of baloney. It's because you saw, or at least I think, it's because we saw through them. They loved violence. They loved it. They enjoyed it. They thought it was cool. And some of us were smart enough to see that violence is not cool. So any kind of romance about all those years and how brave and moral and fantastic it all was, I think, at least I was there. There was nothing romantic, nothing brave, nothing intelligent about Weatherman, and unfortunately a lot about what was going on with the Panthers as well.
That's a good example of the types of animosity that Weatherman kicked up
And you never talk about the people that Weatherman damaged. It's all about them. Years and years of narcissism. Their memoirs. No, you listen for a moment. It's their memoirs and how interesting they were. That's right. Years and years we've heard about how fascinating they are.
I'm trying to give you.
Not about the other lives that they destroyed.
You've had your say.
Please. This type of reaction is not atypical. I mean, Weatherman really did alienate a lot of people during the 1961 and he did so with this sense that they felt that there was nothing that was too much that could be done in the war in Vietnam. The idea that Weathermen were fascinated by violence is not incorrect. I mean, there's no question when you look back at the history that there was a glamour and a celebrity to being a revolutionary. All you have to think about is the images of Che and Fidel, which are ever present even to this day. But the fact is that Weatherman was the least violent part of the equation in a period when the American government is murdering millions of people in Vietnam. Police departments across the country are murdering Black Panthers and everyday African Americans on a daily basis. And so some people felt that it was necessary to put your life on the line. They didn't want to rush into the Days of Rage. They didn't join the movement and then go to the Days of Rage the next day. The Days of Rage happened 5 full years after Jeff's first protest march, which was a peaceful protest. But anyway, some people obviously would prefer to criticize from the sidelines than engage, and that's why the Weathermen were such a splinter faction, and there'll always be a tiny minority of people willing to sacrifice middle-class comforts for the type of total commitment that Days of Rage stood for.
I just want to say, I don't think that Jeff Jones comes from an upper middle class family.
No.
No. I mean, I know what Silma is.
Yeah, so I don't even mind. So in my previous life, before I started working on Jim Crow, I actually wrote a master's thesis about Fred Hampton and the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. And it's interesting to think about the late 1960s from one perspective as being an age of reform, and from another perspective as being the age of COINTELPRO, or being the age of Red Squads that were actually encouraging violence between Black youth on the south side of Chicago by inciting gang violence and all of the day-to-day brutality that people were living and experiencing around the country. It's unfortunate to think about America in a kind of blanket term, people being pro or con-America. When you look at the Panthers' own platform, again, this isn't anything that's revolutionary. I mean, I'm only saying this is somebody who did research on this over a decade ago, but a lot of what they were asking for were simply privileges that were already extended to most white Americans during the New Deal era. And so it's important to think about, even as they are building a kind of mass movement, or trying to build a mass movement that certainly recognizes the violence of the state and talks about it in very incendiary terms, they're also trying to have the country realize a lot of its own tenets and own foundational premises. They're registering voters, they're working through the political process, they're doing a lot of things that can be considered part of that reform moment and are being violently subjugated as a result of that. Again, it's unfortunate that we have a kind of blanket interpretation of what the New Left was doing. Again, I don't consider myself to be an expert in that area, but the archive is pretty clear on this front, that the late 1960s was not by any stretch of the imagination a moment of reform. And I think if you look at the asymmetry in terms of the treatment between how Weather Underground members were treated and that image of Black Panther members being treated, I mean, that's a pretty clear indication of there being very violent, very racist policies in place well into the 1970s. So that's how I would respond.
Oh, yeah, let's get, I'm
Can
sorry.
we talk about sex and gender in all of this?
Sure.
Has not been mentioned.
It
Gender
has
has
not
not
been
been mentioned
mentioned.
at all.
I'm your class of 66 in college,
Yeah.
as am I, and I had this great fascination. I'm not a jock at all or a sports person, but what those black athletes and what rock and roll that was taken over to some extent by Pat Boone and people like that, nonetheless represented was this incredible sexual energy. That was the real pull of black culture for us, that there was all this white bread repression going on after the war, and it was in the black community where people were open about their bodies and their attractions. And some of this was taken over by the white radical left, but in a totally oppressive way. I had many female friends who were sucked in, not to the Weathermen, but to SDS and left-wing supposed to be, excuse my French, effing every man who said yes, you asked them, you weren't supposed to say no. And I think this is where the women's movement came from. That these women who were radicals were so badly treated. It was like a Jim Crow, whatever, leftist movement. And I don't know where obviously your parents had a wonderful egalitarian relationship, and you did too, but I didn't want to get near these radical
Okay,
men.
I can talk about that, the reaction, because even though I was part of a group that started a Bronx anti-war, anti-racist collective in the fall of 1969, of all people who left Weatherman. And within 3 months, there was a women's revolt in the group, and I was one of the major targets. Not because I was a sexual predator, because I knew I had a great thing at home, but because I constantly was dominating the microphone and writing the editorials. So the women in the group said, okay, we are taking over. From now on, the men have to do child care for the women so they can give the speeches and write the editorials. And so I was assigned to babysitting for a young man named Che Nadell. And it was a transformative experience for me and for everyone. But there was definitely that sense that there was a masculinist energy in this whole movement that women finally rebelled against, using the very language that African Americans had used to deal with white paternalism in the movement, and it provoked a revolution that changed the lives of everyone, exposed to it. And so, it's something I could talk about at length, but this was to be about race. But you're absolutely right.
Can I respond to this as well?
Yeah.
So what's interesting about these moments of consensus is that concern about black women's sexuality is actually at the center of a lot of consensus building movement. And you see a remarkable move that happens in the mid to late 60s, where you see concerns about wayward black women driving the urban renewal debate, in fact. That they don't want white men going into black neighborhoods, sleeping with black prostitutes, and black communities don't want their women participating in kind of wayward sexual behavior. And so there's a genuine sense that if you move black women into suburban spaces, they're gonna adhere to all of the necessary heteronormative domestic activities that befit suburbia. It got to the point where even the way that people talked about urban space was in very clearly gendered terms. And I'll just give you one quick quote on this. This is from 1965 in support of urban renewal against the kind of downtown neighborhood. This once beautiful and carefree dame of the 1920s and 30s is haggard and bare, talking about the neighborhood having gone downhill. Despite her tawdry appearance, there is hope. Her rebuilding and beautification by expert technicians are in progress. We hope that she will be a more sedate lady and follow the pattern of her suburban sisters and become a beauty again, minus her dilapidated exterior. She will be so stripped of her rags and redressed in a more sedate finery that even those who forsook her may one day return and reclaim her. That's what gentrification sounded like in 1960.
That's her virginity back.
What's that?
Why would somebody write that?
To support why you.
Well, yes, but I mean, you think it's really unconscious, or they think it's a clever metaphor?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, again, the way that space is being gendered in that period is very clear, and that's how you generate support.
Yeah, David.
There's this really interesting connection between three very different kinds of talks.
Yeah.
And it's about the politics of property and privilege, right? Who gets what, and to what degree that shapes what one can do at a moment when, some would argue things are up for grabs. I don't have a profound question about that. I was wondering if you could, if you had thoughts about that as an organizing principle of the ways that you're talking about this moment of politics and racial privilege.
When the first talk, when you were talking about this underlying reality that is never really recognized when discussing the civil rights movement, of all these negotiations around property, space, real estate, I was feeling the same thing about the discourse about the sports and the music, that people don't see these as political, but they're as influential in shaping people's behavior as all the things we see on television and read about in our courses. And it's a reminder you have to look beneath the surface for explanations of behavior which are much more complicated.
One of the things I would say is, in Mark's view of Brooklyn in the 50s, this is not the 50s that people understand. This is the 50s where there's insurgency on television every single day. Although it's not said, they're not said, look, it's black people and white people together. That's what's happening every single day. And that was brand new, and that's not conformist.
Yeah, and it's in the middle of the McCarthy era, and it's all being done to make money. This is revolutionary capitalist entrepreneurship, you know, that is putting rock and roll out there, that is putting televised sports out there, that are having black and white boxers kick the crap out of each other, with selling Gillette blades for the Friday night fights.
Yes, you know.
So one question to ask is what explains a lot of people's behavior? So the movement was very, very large, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the most important factors is to understand it is to know about class. You want to know about the student's social background. You also want to know about their sex. I think the sexual revolution the so-called sexual revolution was very important, and the first form of it was incredibly sexist. It was like those passages in the Communist Manifesto or in Plato's Republic, where people in favor of the liberation of women were being accused of being communists with regard to women. It's an old idea. But the question asked is, so what drove the movement was very varied, but what drove some people to do violent acts of a certain kind, even though, you know, as tactics, at least I think, they were remarkably foolish. I mean, what ended up happening is the movement alienated the working class. Really smart idea. Really not very clever. So what drove people to do this? Well, I remember in college, this was at Trinity College, which was a small private college. One of the few black students was talking to me, and we talked politics, and he said, you know, and he came from DC, and he impressed me because he wore his jeans rolled up, and in the cuffs there was always a razor blade. And he explained to me why. And I was just new to me. But he said to me, you know, no matter what you do, and we had the second building takeover. Columbia was the third, Howard was the first. He said to me, whatever happens, you can always pull back. I can't remember his exact phrase, but you always go back to your life, which of course is true, and is true altogether. Now this thought, which everyone on the left was very conscious of, right now we're just acting, we're playing a role, we can always retreat to our safe homes, to our parents. Our parents will take us back in. Maybe not all parents will, but a lot of parents. In a sense, that's a class difference too. This upper class of parents who not only take you back in, they could get their congressman to get you to save you from being sent to Vietnam. It's very, very important too. But why take certain sorts of very, very violent actions? It's a way of burning your bridges. And burning your bridges is a way of showing your dedication to the movement, right? And people did these actions. I mean, burning draft cards, right? I mean, it was largely symbolic, but it was also what meant to be a way of doing something illegal, which would burn your bridges. There are people who were 4F who were burning their draft cards, right? But it was an illegal act. And I think that's of some significance in understanding the motivation for some people.
I think that's, I mean, I think that speaks to
Very
what I
powerful.
was saying about kind of how much of the movement was about trying to shed the way you were raised, and then, in fact, I mean, going back to Professor Freud's point about privilege, for Weathermen, racism in the United States meant that white skin privilege was so powerful that in fact they could not get rid of it. They also were privileged in other ways. They had the best legal minds in the country fighting for their defense. But they never really were able to burn all those bridges, although it should be said that some people did, and there are several former Weathermen still in prison who will probably be in prison for decades to come.
I want to talk about one dimension of it that's much more depressing and difficult, and that is with the Panthers. And going back to what Jeff said, the whole idea of picking up the gun was an absolute catastrophe in retrospect. And I'll give you an example of when it didn't happen. In the labor movement in the 1930s, like in the Flint strike, they made a conscious decision never to use guns against the police who were attacking them, sometimes with guns, and it's one of the reasons why they won the strike. Somebody has to dig deep into that whole African-American urban ethos of the 60s to understand the appeal of, you know, and some of it goes back to Malcolm X, the Ballad of the Bullet, but it was a posture that, if you look at the balance of power in the United States, was suicidal. And white radicals cheering it on does, you know, seem unseemly at best. But I still think you have to go into the black community to understand it didn't come. This came from internally. And it's, I can't deal with it. I mean, it's too upsetting to me, but somebody needs to.
Yeah, so I gotta jump in here because gun ownership in the Jim Crow South among African Americans was 90%. Let's be very clear.
Right.
Okay. After World War II, the most important bulwark against white terrorism were black veterans who had guns and had training and were able to defend black communities. So it's not a fair narrative to talk about the late 1960s somehow being a rupture with an earlier period of armed self-defense.
Right.
There's a very deep and important history that goes well into the 19th century of like Civil War veterans defending their communities from night riders and racial terrorism. What's different is, of course, the power of somebody like Martin Luther King to present a narrative of nonviolence that most whites are quite comfortable with, right? And a form of nonviolent direct action that, again, comes out of Bayard Rustin, it comes out of CORE, that most white Americans are very comfortable with. And I think it behooves us to be very smart about the pervasiveness of violence in the urban north, in areas of the rural south, in the constancy of that, and the Panthers' response and the white radicals' mimicking of that response as being in keeping with a general political activity that's going on for a very long time.
Except, okay, I have a friend, an African-American friend in East Texas, who owns 10,000 acres of prime hunting land. And he has 30 guns, including a Uzi. He has to have guns to protect his property.
What about the bazooka?
But he has a bazooka, okay. But he doesn't romanticize it, and in other words, it's one thing to have a gun, it's another thing to make a cult of it the way the Panthers did. And that is, see, instead of saying, okay, we have guns, okay, and we're going to protect our community, it became more than that. Now, is that the Panthers, or is that their supporters? Is it commercial? Is it, Elridge Cleaver's publisher trying to make money from his book? But I can tell you, because I know a lot of what went on in the Panthers, a lot of people died unnecessary deaths because of gun-based adventurism.
By the police?
By the Panthers shooting each other and initiated. There was some shit that went down that was not initiated by the police. And I think that I agree with you. I'm not a gun control person. No. But romanticizing armed struggle in the United States of America is a perilous venture that will end badly.
If you're black.
If you were white in the 30s and you did it, it would have ended badly too. they would have just murdered all the Flint strikers.
Celebrated right now among white political culture.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
Great discussion.
Let's get our conversation.
All right.
I'm going to ask a question that's a lot less
exciting.
Which is about the intersection between radical and electoral politics. And one of the things that's sort of interesting to me in Ty Jones's talk is this sort of turn of your father, who's like a Democratic, capital D, Democratic Party guy, into this radical, and then you talked about this eventual maybe return to politics. And you see that, I think, with a lot of former radicals, this sort of turn towards back to electoral politics, back to elected office. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about some more of that sort of intersection between the seemingly radical system, at least on its face, try to imagine something to work outside of this formal political system, but then the ways in which there's either some return or maybe even in the midst of the movement overlap.
Something that he is fond of, that happened. And he has often talked to me about how SDS had managed to stay together and actually could have blossomed into a real third party or a Labor Party. There was a real missed opportunity to create a truly radical party, mass party in American history. But of course, it didn't split on its own. It didn't split for fun. It split because of the unbelievable pressures of the
But
state.
doesn't that sort of have some faith in the American system?
Yeah, no, I think
When Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed, for a lot of us, that was the story of broken Cowan's battle. As radical as I was, I felt that Bobby Kennedy was the one candidate who could unite, the black population with the increasingly alienated white working class who were looking to George Wallace. And I still had hope that somebody could bring that coalition back. And Dr. King was working towards the same thing with the Poor People's Movement. There were these forces moving towards bringing together people, the electoral coalition that you needed to have real, racial justice and social justice in America. And when Dr. King was killed and then Robert Kennedy was killed, something snapped in me, and I said, this isn't going to work. So now it's for me, it's the streets. And I think I went crazy, actually, to be honest with you. For a couple of years.
You were not alone.
I was out of my fucking mind, pardon my French. I mean, I snapped. And then at a certain point, I went to the edge and realized I was going to die if I took another step further. And I had responsibilities. I had family responsibilities. I had to step back and then figure out how to put it back together. But the country then, we had this great missed opportunity in the late 60s when Robert Kennedy and King were assassinated. I don't think we've ever gotten it back.
I do. I think that Bill Clinton represented that. And
No, wait.
yeah.
Wait, you gotta speak loud.
You gotta speak real loud.
Yes, real loud.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you, do you see any comparisons between urban renewal today, like what's happening in Brooklyn and Spike Lee losing his mind, or what happened in the 60s? Is it different, or is it still kind of the same thing?
Yeah, it's actually much worse now because it's harder to build a kind of concerted movement against gentrification. One of the things that's really important to think about, and it's interesting because in all these arguments about the civil rights movement and about kind of the politics of respectability and showing yourself through the force of direct action and not picking up the gun or not fighting back against police officers, is that taps into a much older and deeper and related stream in black political thought around respectability politics. And King becomes very acceptable as a symbol in post his death in a way that he simply was not accepted in the late 1960s. And it's interesting when you think about folks who were advocating for the protection of property rights and black landlords who very much were against Martin Luther King and against any kind of challenge of their own urban authority. This happened in Chicago in '66, where black ministers were largely responsible for keeping King out of their circle of influence. In the politics of gentrification now, it's also very similar. People who are very radical or very leftist in their fight for poor people's rights are not allowed into that urban regime conversation. They're not allowed into talking about tenant organizing or other kinds of struggles that might in fact allow for an anti-poverty movement to be built into these neighborhoods and built into these gentrification moments. It's a closed system right now, and it's all about capital and raising property values. And one of those property values, I think, is the property value of blackness itself. Like, people really do believe that if you have a gentrified neighborhood, people will regard the inner city or regard African Americans in a better light, and that's an actual continuity between the late 1960s and today.
Wow. I just want to say one thing. Go back to the weatherman destroying SES. They were not alone in doing it. It wasn't only the people who opposed that, progressive labor. The FBI was involved. The FBI ran a COINTELPRO program in which the FBI informers in SDS, which numbered about 120, were told when the convention in Chicago in June '69 was splitting up, that they should engage in the split and they should vote for weatherman as opposed to the anti-weatherman forces. And when, in that famous scene where Bernardine Dorn leads weatherman out of the Coliseum, 700 people, about 100 of them are FBI informants. It is the way that the FBI handled the Panthers. It's exactly the same way that they handled weatherman. And I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened anyway, but they contributed to making it happen as much as they could.
Let me just want to say something about Fred Hampton. One of the things that Fred Hampton tried to do was unite the black, Latino, and white gangs of Chicago. He was trying, in his own way, to do what Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy were trying to do.
He coined the term Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah. And all of that possibility was smashed in various ways in the late 60s. That was to try to bring this increasingly divided working class and middle class together to fight for justice to all of them. Instead, white and middle class flight continued, and the right took over the white.
One last question, and it's from Dr. Cecile.
Actually, the question's for Mark, and you've already, I think, started to address it. So I thought your working class perspective was really useful, and you clearly have a unique personal story, but by connecting it with the broader popular culture. And then I struggle with thinking of Bedford-Stuyvesant of that is portrayed, say, in Spike Lee's movie Do the Right Thing. And we know that from the incident that happened a couple of years ago, I forget the name, African-American gentleman shot someone on the edge of his property because he was on Long Island. It became a big story.
Right, yeah.
And Long Island is the most segregated place in America. So how do you get from your experience to the 70s, the 80s?
I just saw, like, the Bronx, there's a certain point at which the whites fled in rage from blacks and Latinos moving into their neighborhoods and retreated into suburbs holding a powerful sense of grievance about what's had been their sacred spaces. This is not an unemotional migration, because people had had these wonderful feelings about these urban neighborhoods, and they felt defiled and betrayed. They didn't see the larger forces shaping it, of deindustrialization, and capital flight and all those things. They saw it as black people came in and ruined the beautiful neighborhood. And they said, we're not going to do it again. There's a great book, Canarsie, The Jews and Italians of Brooklyn Against Liberalism, by Jonathan Reeder, which talks about that in a certain part of Brooklyn. And then eventually those folks left Canarsie when it became a mostly West Indian neighborhood. But there is something creeping into the white suburbs, and that is interracial extended families. There's no longer a white working class. It's a darkening working class. And I have another place in eastern Long Island. I hang out with pickup truck gun carrying folks, and all of them have Latino or black relatives. So there's another thing starting to happen, but nobody quite knows how to describe it, politicize it. But those Tea Party people are not as white as you think they are. That's all I can tell you.
Well,
So
thank
that
you.
may make some hope.
Thank you very much. I think the theme that's come through here is complexity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
You started it.
particularity.
Oh,
And I
boy.
want to thank the three marvelous